It's time for business news now, and Stephen Carroll joins me on the set for that. Hi, Stephen.
Hi, Olivia.
Now, we're starting with Boeing's 737 MAX plane, which is set to return to European skies very soon.
The European Union's aviation regulator says the 737 MAX will be approved to resume flights in Europe from next week. The Boeing plane was grounded in 2019 after two deadly crashes. The head of the EU's Aviation Safety Agency says their four main conditions have now been met after the plane builder made changes to the aircraft. It's already resumed passenger flights in the United States.
Now, we're staying with transport. Figures showing how the motor industry was hit by the pandemic last year.
New car registrations across the European Union fell by almost a quarter in 2020. That's according to figures from the European Automobile Manufacturers Association. It's the biggest yearly drop in demand since records began. Spain saw the worst plunge, down by almost a third, followed by Italy and France.
Not many people buying cars here in France then, and people in France are still working out how to adapt their shopping habits to the new 6 p.m. curfew. I empathise.
Yeah, I think a lot of us do. Monday was the first working day since that earlier curfew was imposed. It's a move which retail groups have warned risks 30% of revenues for shops. It's a big shift for consumers too, as Catherine Viette now reports.
Gare Saint-Lazare, anxious commuters are running for the train home, hoping to beat the new 6 p.m. curfew. But this train has been cancelled, which means its passengers won't make it home in time.
Je suis parti une heure plus tôt du travail pour espérer rentrer à peu près dans les temps, mais là, compte tenu de l'horaire, je serai de toute façon en dehors des clous sans autorisation.
A rush of customers, too, ahead of closing time at this bakery in the Paris suburbs.
Il y a trop de monde à l'Intermarché, il y a trop de monde à la pharmacie et trop de monde à la boulangerie.
C'est un peu la course sec, vous avez vu, hein. Je fais les courses, McDo et le pain, je suis obligé de le faire avant 18h, malgré le travail et on est obligé de s'adapter.
In Bordeaux, as stores shut an hour earlier, the majority of customers are now finishing their errands at 5 p.m. Many shopkeepers worry this will mean a big drop in sales.
C'est triste, ça coupe tout le commerce à partir de 17h, on va dire. Il n'y a plus personne à partir de 17h.
Some people are waiting till the last minute to head home.
On voulait rester, mais on est resté jusqu'à la fin, là. On se dépêche de rentrer.
Between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m., anyone who breaks curfew without a valid reason risks a €135 fine.
The COVID-19 pandemic, as well as killing millions of people, has also worsened health, economic and digital inequalities. That's the message from the World Economic Forum, the organisation behind the annual Davos gathering. Its annual Global Risks Report highlights what it calls clear and present dangers from disease and loss of livelihoods. For more on this, we're joined now by Sadia Zahidi, the Managing Director of the World Economic Forum. Sadia, thanks for being with us. Of course, the pandemic is top of your list, but you're focusing on many of the wide-ranging effects that that's having on people around the world.
Yeah. Over the last years, we've been pointing out the potential risk of a pandemic, and while it may be low likelihood, it would have a very high impact. And that's the lens through which we're now looking at all of these other risks, given that we've just seen one of these major risks become reality. And in the short term, it's very much about not just the shockwaves created by the pandemic itself and the health crisis, but also the losses of jobs, rising disillusionment among youth, and digital inequality and its consequences at a time where economies are being run on digital. And if you look at the medium term, that's where you see a lot of the risks that are economic. So, of course, all of the spending that governments have done, that's likely to lead to potential debt crises. There's the risk of runaway inflation. There's the risk of commodity shocks and asset price bubbles. And then finally, in 5 to 10 years out, it's really about those big existential risks that have remained the same for the last few years. And that is climate change, potential of weapons of mass destruction, and the potential of a sort of disintegrating multilateral system.
Yeah, I mean, on one of those points, climate again ranking very highly, both in the short and long term. How do those separate in terms of what's the most immediate risk? And is there anything encouraging in how the world is preparing to face that?
You know, they're very connected to each other. In the very short term, the big concern is more man-made threats to the climate. And in the very long term, the issue is a failure to adapt and mitigate climate change. So that's obviously very linked. But there is, to some extent, some potential silver lining, which is we have an opportunity to reset how our economies are shaped as most governments look towards the recovery. We don't necessarily have to return to growth alone in a directionless manner, but rather growth that is more sustainable and more inclusive. And you've seen, of course, in Europe and in some other parts of the world, there has been a focus on trying to get the next wave of support from governments to be a sort of green stimulus. Now it remains to be seen, will it go far enough?
One of those newer risks that you mentioned a little earlier is this idea of widening digital inequality, something, of course, worsened by the pandemic. What can be done to address that now that it's been presented in such stark terms?
You know, one major aspect that has to be dealt with is that more than half of the world still doesn't have basic digital access, just simply doesn't have basic electricity and internet access. And so that's one area that has to be managed. Otherwise, we're looking at a sort of K-shaped recovery for the whole world, not just within economies, but developing countries going off on a very different trajectory from the advanced world. A second area is even where there is internet access, people don't actually have the right skills and capabilities to thrive in the modern economy. And so developing and developed economies alike have to do a massive next wave of investment in skills and human capital development. That means changing education systems, but frankly, it also means changing learning for the 3 billion people that are already in the world's workforce.
Now, the World Economic Forum is best known for the Davos meeting, usually takes place this time of the year. This year it's going to be virtual, of course, because of the pandemic. What will that change, I suppose, in the way that Davos works?
You know, next week is going to be deeply focused on very much the themes of the Global Risks Report. So day one is all about how to deal with the socioeconomic fallout of the crisis, but also how to shape a new way forward. What do those new economies need to look like? The second day is deeply focused on the aspect of the industrial transition, in particular for businesses to head towards net zero. Third day, very much about climate change and putting in place the right kinds of policies for that. Fourth day, all about closing those digital divides. And the fifth day, about global cooperation. None of this is really possible without much deeper regional and global cooperation. So that's where leaders are going to be focused and addressing, we hope, many of the long-term risks that are raised by this report.
OK, and we'll be following that here too, of course, in France 24. Sadia Zahidi from the World Economic Forum, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks.
Let's take a quick look at what's happening on the markets for you now. European shares trading up this lunchtime. London, Paris and Frankfurt all seeing some gains. Shares in the Swiss chocolate maker Lindt are down 2.5% in Zurich, though, after it reported a fall in sales in 2020. I did my best to make up for that.
I'm very surprised to see that chocolate consumption has gone down. Thank you very much for that business update, Stephen.